Aaron's eldest two sons, Nadav and Avihu, bring an unauthorized incense offering and a heavenly fire consumes them. The heavenly fire that consumes them does not burn them in the sense that you would imagine, some kind of a fire like that consumed the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah, Sodom and Amorah. And we know this from the very next thing that happens. Moses orders the removal of their bodies from the tabernacle and instructs Aaron and his remaining two sons not to observe the traditional laws of mourning, considering that they had to continue serving in the sanctuary on behalf of the Jewish people. If a fire consumed them, then what bodies are there to remove? In fact, their bodies were completely intact, not damaged in any way. Their clothes weren't even singed, and yet a fire came down and consumed them. The sages explained that this was a miraculous occurrence. The fire that came down and consumed them actually split into two strings for each of them, so four altogether, entered their nose, their nostrils, and basically sucked out and brought back on high their souls. In the very same way that in creating man, God put together a body and then breathed soul into that body through the nostrils, something that was not the case for any other creation. Animals, he said, let there be animals. Birds, let there be birds. Fish, let there be whatever it is. For man, he put him together on the physical side, an actual body, and then he breathed a soul into him because man is made of those two components. So in this scenario, that fire came down and took back the soul, and the souls ascended on high. And the bodies were left. They were not burned in the traditional understanding at all. Again, their clothes weren't even singed. It's a little strange that there should be a miraculous and actually quite spiritual form of death for these two people who obviously did something wrong, otherwise they wouldn't have been punished by being put to death. So which one is it? Did they do something wrong and then they should have suffered, a regular death or some kind of a physical, maybe even painful death? Or did they somehow deserve this very special and spiritual and miraculous death? And then why is it that they're considered to have done something wrong? There are in fact different aspects, different levels of explanation as to what they did wrong. That they did something wrong is very clear because again, they were punished by the fact that they passed away. However, when we go through all of the levels of explanation as to what they did wrong, we see one common denominator. The simple meaning of the verse, as it says here in the summary, is that they brought an unauthorized incense offering. An offering that wasn't commanded, they just decided of their own accord to bring. Specifically an incense offering. Of all the different kinds of offerings that there are, animal, a bird, vegetation, wine libation, whatever, the incense offering is in fact the holiest. One of the ways that we know that is that on the holiest day of the year, on Yom Kippur, when the holiest person in the world, the Kohen Gadol, goes into the holiest place in the world, the Kodesh HaKodashim, the Holy of Holies, he goes in there for basically one service on Yom Kippur, and that is the bringing of the incense offering. So it's the holiest offering that there is. They want it to be holy. Regardless of the fact that it wasn't commanded, they decided that their desire to be holy is what matters, and so they brought this unauthorized incense offering. The Torah portion, or I should say the Torah paragraph that comes right after this particular narrative is the prohibition of serving for a Kohen while drunk. A Kohen who has drunk more than a revis, more than 3.2 fluid ounces of wine, cannot serve in the tabernacle or temple, lest he not know whether his service is properly done or improperly done. The fact that that is the very next paragraph in the whole of the Torah, right after the passing of these two sons of Aaron, the sages tell us is not by mistake and not by coincidence, but is very much on purpose. It's to tell us that they had actually consumed wine before entering the tabernacle and bringing this unauthorized incense offering. And so, immediately after the narrative, to show you what kind of an effect, what kind of a negative result such an action can have, there's that codification of that prohibition. Why would they, or any other Kohen for that matter, drink wine and then go serve? Our sages tell us that when wine goes in, secrets come out. And the implication there is when one has a little bit of l'chaim, as we saw in Purim and as we see in a regular, perfectly kosher and even holy environment, a person is a little bit less inhibited in his desire and in his readiness to devote himself to serving God. When we quell the influence of the animal soul with a little bit of mashka, or in this case a little bit of wine, the godly soul can come out a little bit more. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it's a very holy thing when done in the right way. Nevertheless, with all of that desire notwithstanding, it's wrong in the context of the service in the tabernacle. But again, Nadav and Avihu, these two sons of Aaron, they wanted to be that much more spiritual, and so they drank wine and then they went to serve. Another explanation given by our sages is that they adjudicated Torah law, halacha, in front of Moses and Aaron. There is a scenario where a particular person comes and asks a question about offerings and impurity, and they know the law, and so they answer, and they answer correctly. But because they answered while in the presence of Moses and Aaron, their father and their rabbi, their teacher, that in and of itself is wrong. They, by law, had to wait, and either Moses and Aaron would have answered that person or would have deferred, and then they could answer once that deferral had occurred. But they didn't wait. They wanted to make sure that this person knew what God wanted of him. Specifically, what the impurity, purity, offerings, etc. situation was. And so they answered, and they answered correctly. But nevertheless, because they didn't have that check to their desire, they are said to have sinned. Finally, the sages tell us that Nadav and Avihu, these two sons of Aaron, refused to be married. They wanted to serve God with no interruptions, with no distractions, with no requirement to split their time and energies between family and my relationship with God. And so, that also is considered a sin on their part. As much as their intent was positive. It's not that they didn't want to marry for some debauchery or immorality. It's that they wanted to be able to devote every waking hour only to God, whether in studying Torah or teaching Torah or fulfilling the commandments or offerings in the temple, whatever it is. They didn't want the distraction of a wife and children. Nevertheless, that's considered a sin. All four of these are different, but all four of them are based on the same basic common denominator. What's called rotzoi bli shoiv. Desire without check, without control. Our desire to serve God is wonderful and absolutely needs to be there. But God is the one who decides how to serve Him. We don't get to decide how to serve Him. And so as much as they wanted to bring an extra offering of incense, that's not up to you to decide whether to do so or not. As much as they wanted to drink a little bit, to say a little l'chaim and then go serve, that's not up to you to decide to do that. They wanted to tell the person what the halacha was. They didn't want to get married. That's not up to you to do that. God says, this is the law for this is the law for that. I decide how you should serve me. And only when we follow through with both components, desire to serve, but then the proper control and direction to serve according to God's will, then we don't have any problems. Anything outside of that, unfortunately, is actually not very good. Towards the very end of the third aliyah, the priests are instructed not to imbibe wine before performing temple service. This is the reason why, if you remember to Simchas Torah, obviously, Simchas Torah is one of the biblical holidays, and so we have Birchas Kohanim, the blessing of the priests, on Simchas Torah. But unlike every other example of a biblical holiday, when we have the priestly blessing on that holiday, when the priestly blessing is done in Musaf, towards the very end of the morning service, On Simchas Torah, it's done specifically in Shachris, in the morning service, not the additional service, earlier. And the reason is that technically, after Hallel, before Musaf, you can already drink. You can already say Kiddush, have a little bit of mezenis, a little bit of cake or something like that, and then drink. And then you can do Musaf later. Though that's practically not what's done, technically it's allowed to be done. And therefore the universal Jewish custom is, lest the Koyanim get a little bit too happy on Simchas Torah morning, they should do their currently available service, namely the priestly blessing, in Shachris, before one can actually make Kiddush and drink. And then whatever happens by Kiddush is fine, and then we're going to have the Musaf with no priestly blessing at that point.